Tom, great to be with you again. Thank you. We wanted to get you to focus today on an issue that's getting a lot of traction in the media and in government and also in the energy industry, and that is the long-term transition that the global energy system is expected to undergo over the next 30 years. It's a big issue. It's got a lot of ramifications for the economy and significant implications for rural America as well.
It certainly does. I'm very excited about the topic. So excited I wore my boots and came through 36 inches of snow to participate today.
Great. We are also joined today by a special guest, Teri Viswanath, our energy analyst here at CoBank. Teri, thank you for joining us as well.
No, I'm glad to be here.
Tom, what is expected to occur globally in the energy system over the next 30 years?
Well, in a nutshell, what we're experiencing is a very rapid acceleration of technological change, and the defining attribute of it over the next several decades is going to be the migration out of a world where energy production and consumption has been dominated by hydrocarbon fuels to one that becomes dominated by electricity.
What are the key drivers of this change as we understand it today?
Is technological change, right? The advent of ubiquitous, cheap, and effective, scalable, renewable energy when connected to storage capability through industrial scale batteries is going to be a totally transformative technological combination that facilitates this change. And it's going to have immense ramifications both economically and politically for the world order.
Teri, what would you add on top of that, including concerns about climate change in government and regulation?
First is that, everything is sort of coalescing. So the economics are working. I think consumer sentiment really is forcing a shift. We've never experienced a time ever where we've actually seen most energy sources, new energy sources, are bolt-on. In this case, we're actually seeing a really important change, a revolutionary change, a pattern toward renewable adoption, and this is new.
Let's set the context here with a chart. Affordable energy is an important ingredient to an economy and to economic growth. This chart shows multiple forms of energy and their cost over a long time horizon here. And as you can see, they've basically either stayed flat or even trended down over the last couple of decades. Talk about this issue and the importance of maintaining energy affordability for the economy.
This is obviously a tremendous benefit for the economy of the United States that we have these sources of energy and that they're so affordable and that there's such a low amount of volatility. What this simple chart tells you is we've got plenty of power in these multiple forms. It's very ubiquitous, it's very low volatility, and therefore it's not a big problem, right? We are well endowed with energy resources as a country. Which puts us in a frankly, an unprecedentedly strong position for the next several decades of economic growth in this country.
Let's bring up the next chart. So this is a chart derived from a report put out by BP recently where they project out the share of energy globally by source. And you can see that fossil fuels, which today are over 80%, of total energy produced, declining basically by half, renewables increasing very significantly. Talk about what's happening to make this transition occur and the scale of this transition that's represented in the chart.
Well, the scale and the speed are really quite dramatic and remarkable. And as I say, this is predominantly made possible and galvanized by a process of innovation and technological change. It is, however, aided and abetted substantially by tailwinds currently of public policy for dealing with greenhouse gas emissions, public consciousness, which manifests as consumer behavior and the like. This comes from BP, who is in the oil and gas business. So, you would expect them to be conservative, but this is a pretty dramatic document. And if this is even remotely right, the oil and gas companies and complex are going to become less valuable over the coming years and decades.
Let's bring up the next chart. Teri, I'll have you talk about this. This is also from this BP report, and it's focused on this electrification idea. And this is 3 different scenarios of the degree to which electricity is really the dominant source of energy in the economy. And at the high level, it's over 50%. If that comes to pass, what is happening in the economy and in individual sectors that makes this transition happen?
In industrialized nations right now, demand is basically flat for electricity. So what's going to boost electricity is that idea of deep decarbonization. In order to get there, you're going to have to see nations like the US, where already our building use, it's about 40% of building use is going to be electricity. It's going to have to increase in this sector. More importantly, transportation, where you see less than 1% globally, is going to have to pick up. Transportation is really oil focused. It's going to have to shift if we're thinking about deep decarbonization.
Talk about what happens, for instance, in the transportation sector to hit that high line on the chart. What is really happening there in terms of electric car adoption, for instance?
Passenger cars are likely going to see a strong adoption of EVs. Heaviest adoptions are going to be in Asia, China in particular, and in Europe. But the US is going to follow. And so most people will actually, the next car they're going to be purchasing after 2030 will likely be an electric vehicle.
Outside transportation, where would you see what other sectors would change the most from where we are today?
We're going to see deeper inroads with regard to industry use. 30% of industry use, the heat exchange process happens to be, natural gas. You're going to see that switch over, and we're going to see a heavier concentration of electricity being used in those carbonized areas.
Tom, you talk about the economic impacts of this transition that we're going to see over the next couple of decades if this really happens.
This is what our old friend Joseph Schumpeter called the process of creative destruction. And that's what a market economy is. That's what a market economy does. There will be an immense amount of organizational change, right? The ubiquitous gas station with a petrol pump, will not disappear, but there'll be a lot fewer of them, and they will be replaced by charging stations, of which there are going to need to be tens of thousands that don't currently exist. But there will be a whole bunch of other changes, certain activity and jobs and so forth that happen today in very great numbers. Some of them will disappear entirely, some will just reduce dramatically, but they'll be replaced by entirely new things. So there's going to be a lot of change. But that's not something we should fear. That's something that we should accept as part of a vigorous, competitive market economy that generates good outcomes for our citizens.
Teri, how prepared would you say is the utility industry today to adapt to and address this change that's coming?
I think this idea of growth is going to be new, but I think it's an industry that's prepared for that growth. We just have some work to do. So 70% of our infrastructure is end of life with regard to delivering those electrons, and we need to reinvest. So it's strongly an argument for reinvestment, but it is an industry that is prepared to keep the lights on.
Interesting that you say the industry hasn't really been dealing with growth. That's just because electricity demand has been pretty flat in this country. Is that correct?
Exactly right. So although we've had new connections, new houses, we've seen household growth, we become incredibly efficient. And that's a great story with regard to decarbonizing. You want to be efficient. But in this case, we're going to be decarbonizing transportation, industry, and we're going to see more building use. So it really is a paradigm shift. You're going to see these utilities that are going to have to sort of pick up speed, reinvest, and be prepared for that growth.
Let's bring up the last slide and last question for you, Tom. The global economy and the global kind of geopolitical system today is largely organized around fossil fuel, and this slide shows the top 10 oil exporting nations. Talk about what it means to be shifting away from fossil fuels, and is that going to be a stabilizing trend overall, or is it going to be a destabilizing trend, do you think?
That's an enormously important question that's relatively challenging to answer. If everything that we've been talking about here is accurate, and I believe it is broadly, we are going to be also leaving behind a world where the prospect, probability, location of war, conflict, and other international phenomena have been substantially influenced by who has energy, who controls energy, how do you get it from the difficult places where you find it to the places that you process and ultimately have to use it. So this change is going to have immense impact for those big oil exporters. There's going to be a big diminution of their cash flow, and thus ultimately cash flow drives the attributes of national power, military, economic, and otherwise. So some people and countries are going to be net losers of this. Others are going to be net winners. And frankly, the net distribution of gains will be much, much more democratized than has been the case in a world dominated by fossil fuels, which is to say, wind and solar are pretty well distributed across the face of the earth. You can build scalable batteries pretty much anywhere, and therefore the ability of a small number of locations and countries to have a disproportionate influence in international politics and international economics because of the attributes of the fossil fuel industry will change dramatically.
Teri, there's a phrase, energy poverty. I wonder if you could just talk about what that means and then tie it into the comments Tom just made.
Absolutely. So you're right. The distribution is changing. That shift that we're going to see in terms of the availability, where onshore wind and solar right now in 2/3 of the world represent the lowest and cheapest form of energy. So we're talking about a really important distribution that is going to lift up a lot of those communities that don't have power. And it's an exciting story.
We're going to be back shortly with part 2 of this interview, where we're going to focus on the implications of this trend for the rural economy here in the United States. Thank you both so much.